begin on time because we have a really full program. Thank you all for coming. I am Cynthia Roman, print curator at the Lewis Walpole Library for anyone who doesn't know me. And it is my really distinct pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the library to Tim Clayton's lecture, The Limits of Free Speech, Gillray, the Royals, and Censorship, which will be followed by a panel discussion when Steve Bell and Martin Rowson will join him. And as you all know, they're long-running giants of political cartooning. Programs like this reflect the vision of our benefactor, W.S. Lewis, for his library to be a center for 18th century culture. And additionally, it fits our commitment today to collaborate at the university and beyond to connect these collections across the centuries for researchers and audiences today. And this one is especially fit because, as you know, the library's holdings of graphic satire are substantial. Tim's magisterial prize-winning book, James Gillray, A Revolution in Satire, makes clear that Gilray's work deserves, continues to command attention. And Steve and Martin will share their perspectives on the legacy of Gillray, their engagement with Gilray's prints, and why his satires still resonate today. So cartoons, of course, often provoke laughter. I think that's what we think about them. Especially as, you know, we all grew up with cartoons as children. But serious political cartoons have always been controversial, even verging on inflammatory. They often express things that would be considered out of bounds as plain text, and they can be on the edge of dangerous. They were so in the 18th century, and they continue to be so today. And this is a point that will be proven by many of the images that our presenters will share that tackle current concerns. So finally, Tim's book has happily connected us with David Bromwich, who is Sterling Professor of English at Yale, following his stellar review of Tim's book as we were planning this event. And thank you, David, for all your conversation and counsel as we put this together. So Professor Bromwich is preeminently suited to introduce Tim, and I turn over to David now.
Thank you. It's a pleasure for me and an honor to introduce Tim Clayton, a scholar of such unusually varied interests and accomplishments that I can only touch on a few here. Tim Clayton's major work in 18th century British art and culture began with the English print, 1688 to 1802, and includes also the catalogue raisonné George Stubbs' The Complete Engraved Works, and most recently and remarkably, James Gillray, A Revolution in Satire. The English print was a comprehensive survey. It covered the range of productions from prints of Stubbs's Tigress, for example, to David Garrick as Hamlet, to the Battle of Constantine by Lebrun, to Joshua Reynolds's portrait of Lady Charlotte Fitzwilliam. A notable strength of that book was to restore to their proper dignity the print makers of the 18th century, whose enterprise kept certain images extraordinarily vivid in the popular imagination. Achievements like theirs are apt to be wrongly forgotten, much like the work of set designers, say, and studio composers in motion pictures. It was a piece of genuine historical recovery to have revived their work as Clayton did. I haven't mentioned and can only mention a separate and partly distinct area of his writing, which comes out in his book Tars, a narrative of the British Navy in the 7 Years' War, his book-length accounts of two great battles of the Napoleonic Wars, Trafalgar and Waterloo, and the books that he co-wrote with Phil Craig on the Battle of Britain, Finest Hour, and The End of the Beginning, which takes the history of the Second World War from the evacuation of Dunkirk to the North Africa campaign. Back to our subject. James Gillray, A Revolution in Satire, is the book I had been looking for, the book that would do justice to the greatest of political cartoonists, and anyone who knew Clayton's earlier work might have guessed where that book would come from. It's a proper biography as well as a work of cultural history, and has the kind of richness that we cherish in biographies. But what makes it a great book is its tenacity in pursuit of detail across all the many areas in which Gillray lived and worked. As a portraitist, parodist, a visionary satirist, a political propagandist, an entrepreneur, and hired enemy of one party or the other, and occasionally both parties at once. But most of all, a bearer of the self-imagining of Britain during an era of revolution and retrenchment. Gillray had a hard life himself, along with an eye and ear that made life hard on those he portrayed. And Clayton's Gillray is remarkable for an unforced sympathy that's by no means a predictable concomitant of scholarly immersion in the life of a difficult and complex human being. An excrescence, a fungus, alias a toadstool upon a dunghill was the title of an anti-Pitt cartoon published by Gillray in 1791. Thomas Wright and R.H. Evans spoke of it in these terms in their 1851 book on Gillray, describing the cartoon. That upstart thing which the opposition said was at this time engrafting itself upon the crown and become superior to the crown itself, a political mushroom springing up on the hotbed of royal favor. Favor carries a better sting with the O-U-R in English spelling. I'm not sure why. Even in such a straightforward early appreciation, 1851, one may notice a peculiar adroitness in the paraphrase. I think this is a quality of many written responses to the great cartoonists. Their wit is a cause of wit in others, and the reason is that cartoons work by a condensation that is a kind of dream work. There is nothing in the world, not a slip, not an unseemly private signal when you thought you were off stage, that is not fodder for caricature. Uncensored judgment in this picture form can lead the viewer to an uncensored acknowledgement. There was no good reason why so many gifted cartoonists should have drawn Richard Nixon's nose as a penis. It wasn't that bad a nose. But almost no one, not even his running mate President Eisenhower, ever denied that Nixon was a low person in some hard-to-express but undeniable way. Or take another 20th century instance. David Levine, in 1966, published a cartoon of President Johnson pulling up his bedclothes after a gallbladder operation to show a crocodile-shaped scar on his abdomen. On a second look, the scar proved to be a map of Vietnam. How could that image seem at the time, and I remember the time, a bit sickening and equally a smashing stroke of deserved ridicule? Johnson was obsessed with his bombing campaign in Vietnam. He had the attack maps on his office wall, and he was eager for victory in a disastrous war from which his popularity never recovered. The same man had pulled up his hospital gown at Bethesda Naval Hospital in a gesture of misjudged intimacy and exhibitionist pride to show the White House press corps the scar from his surgery. Thanks to the genius of a single cartoon, the monstrous atrocity abroad found its correlative in the tiny indiscretion at home. When Tim Clayton looks at a print by Hogarth or Gillray or any of their contemporaries, he can tell you not just what the burden is, what message it immediately carries to its readers, but also which side it was ostensibly taking, what complications may underlie that apparent commitment, what earlier painting or monument or cultural icons it alludes to, and where it was sold and to what sort of buyers. He also lets you know what he thinks of its quality, but mostly he does that between the lines. He works from the maxim that accurate description and comprehension ought to come first. But Clayton is possessed of a visual and discursive intelligence that is rare in art historians, too many of whom confine themselves, whether by choice or necessity, to source hunting or else some version of contextualism, as if once you've got the motives and circumstances down, judgment and value will take care of themselves. Works of art have a character as surely as their authors do, and Clayton is a generous and unsentimental judge of character. His lecture today will be followed by a discussion with two panelists. Martin Rowson has been a cartoonist for The Guardian and the Daily Mirror, among other publications, controversial in himself and the cause of controversy in others. He works with a range of literary reference as wide as Gillray's. and among his books have been graphic versions of Gulliver's Travels, Tristram Shandy, and The Wasteland. Steve Bell also has been a cartoonist for The Guardian, provocative in his criticism of the UK political establishment, and especially regarding its policies toward Israel and Palestine. His work prefers to chafe where others might appease. It is erudite as well as often scabrous, depending on parody, allusion, and specific reference, in a way that recalls the practice of modern poetry and painting more than political commentary of any recent period. They will speak after Tim Clayton, and I ask you to join me now in welcoming our lecturer for the talk entitled The Limits of Free Speech, Gillray, Royals, and Censorship.
Thank you, David, for that very flattering account. So this is a picture of the King and Queen on a royal privy, with the Prime Minister coming in with the bad news that another monarch has been done over. It's the sort of thing I doubt you could get away with today. Yeah. But he got away with it then. But it isn't, I mean, there is a myth that caricaturists could get away with anything, and that free speech was allowed in England at this date, and caricature was a particularly privileged medium. I don't really think that's true, and I'm going to look at some of the ways in which the limits are hit now. I'm going to look in particular at Gillray in the 1780s and 1790s. The younger Gillray, who is establishing himself as a caricaturist, and he was promoted first by William Holland, who's standing there on the left with his daughter and his wife behind him, pictured in Newgate after he was arrested in 1793 for going just a little bit too far, ostensibly for selling Tom Paine, but that's what he was tried for. But he was the famous Jacobin caricaturist who they really wanted to get rid of. And he is the guy who started Gillray on his way. And he started Gillray on his way with pictures of the royal family, particularly. In December 1785, the Prince of Wales took it into his head to marry a Catholic divorcee, which he wasn't allowed to do because she was Catholic, and also because he could only marry according to the Royal Marriage Act that George III had passed with George III's permission. Gillray imagines them marrying. Rumours had come out by the time this print is published, and Gillray imagines them marrying abroad. Actually, they married in her house. She's given away by Charles James Fox, standing on the left of Maria Fitzherbert, and the priest is Edmund Burke, whose glasses and long nose and Jesuit biretta is treated as crypto-Catholic, become familiar things in Gillray. Holland is big with advertisements. He's very good with the newspaper, and this is very useful to me. I got a lot out of newspaper advertisements. And he bigs Gillray up. He bigs caricature up generally. He starts to name his artists as we go on, and he suggests new ways in which they can be consumed and displayed. But Gillray is still anonymous. He's anonymous throughout the 1780s, and into 1792 is where he begins to sign things, really. But we are, he's letting you know that there is an artist whose inimitable genius produces this series of prints, and this is the biggest finest caricature ever produced. And they are big, some of these things that Holland's selling, much bigger than the average caricature is 10 by 14. Holland does much bigger things and sells them for more money. And so this is a new way to pay the national debt. And Pitt has introduced measures to reduce the national debt. The joke is that the joke Gillray is giving you is that the king had used massive election bribery out of the privy purse to secure Pitt's election. Now Pitt's giving it back to him. The Prince of Wales is in rags. And typically for Gillray, I mean, this is a Hogarthian type print. The limbless sailor on the bottom left is a sympathy figure that he uses, that sort of thing he uses quite frequently. His own father had had his arm shot off, probably he's lost his arm probably at the Battle of Fontenoy, and was a Chelsea pensioner. And in the background, similarly, you get Hogarthian notes of the last dying speech of 54 malefactors executed for robbing of a hen roost. From Germany just arrived a large and royal assortment. The last, the dying groans of liberty, British property, a farce. He often gives you this sympathy with the ordinary people in the background. And the assault on royalty of the 1780s is not just confined to caricatures and visual things. He's working very close. Gillray keeps a very close eye on Peter Pindar, John Walcott, whose most famous poem is the Lausiad. This is Thomas Rowlandson's frontispiece to the second or third edition of the Lausiad. The king finds a louse on his dinner plate is the starting point. What's that? What's that? The astonished monarch cries, lifting to pitying heaven his piteous eyes. What monster's that that's got into the house? Look, 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 Charlie, is not that a louse? The Queen looked down and said, Mein Gott, good da! And with a smile, the grey-backed stranger saw. The point being that Walcott begins to invent speech patterns, these staccato speech patterns for the king that Gillray picks up and runs with. Now, William Holland is not just selling fine caricatures. He also does a line in flagellation literature. And this flagellation literature it survives almost exclusively in late reproductions done in the 1870s, and people have been very unsure when it was published and who published it. But I think I've pinned it down to William Holland now. The advertisements make it fairly clear. So this is a list of his stock. And he's selling all this stuff, Madame Bacchini's Dance, Lady Bumtickler's Revels, and other famous earlier works, along with his Gillray prints down at the bottom. Lady Termagant Flaybum going to give her stepson a taste of dessert after dinner, and colours 7 and 6, black and white, 5 shillings. They're quite expensive prints, quite expensive as caricatures go. This one's people have always thought it's the Countess of Strathmore in a famous court case of a couple of years later, but I don't think it is. It's too early for that. And I think it is simply a sort of large form of advertisement for Holland's whipping enterprises. As is the contest of Barre whipping the Marchioness de Rowson. I've never seen an impression of that. It's a mezzotint, so it's probably not by Gillray. The Admiral kissing the gunner's daughter completely disappeared. but then Wife and No Wife, which is Gillray. A Sale of English Beauties in the East Indies, which is Gillray. So he's rather closely implicated in these things, and what I find intriguing is that all these pamphlets were illustrated. None of the illustrations survive. When somebody finds one, I want to know about it. Was it Gillray? There's a gap in his production at just this moment. And what happened to them? They're not the only things that don't survive. That's the one impression that I have seen of Dog and Duck Bruises at the bottom, a print published by Holland. Andrew Edmonds had never seen one. But the Holland's involvement in Gillray and in this stuff, it runs closely together. You can be quite sure that it's him. You can be sure that it's him because in the corner of A Sale of English Beauties, you've got a little box. The idea is that the English beauties have been going out to India to make their fortunes, and they're being bought up by rich nabobs and rich Indians as they arrive in the country, but also exported with them for the amusement of military gentlemen is a box of female flagellants, Fanny Hill, moral tales, and a little box of whips. Whether Holland was involved in some actual enterprise, I don't know. And Holland isn't the only kind of guy who gets labelled as a Jacobin that Gillray was involved with. James Ridgway was the Foxite Whigs' preferred bookseller, and he also was responsible for publishing Whig propaganda directed against William Pitt. When they lost the 1784 election, the Whigs responded with some marvellous stuff about how unfit the young Pitt was to rule them. The Virgin Minister, who is impervious to women. And one of their publications was the Rolliad, which was it's actually a commentary on a supposed epic poem, published by James Ridgway, and Westminster School there, also published by Ridgway, is effectively a big print advertisement for it, in the same way that Lady Termagant Flaybum is an advertisement for Holland's whipping literature. Whipping happens to feature again in a most unhealthy way. It pretends to be about Dr. Busby, a 17th century headmaster of Westminster School, but actually it's about the current headmaster of Westminster School, who was also famous for flogging. Ridgway goes on to publish other similar dodgy stuff. The British Mercury was edited by a guy called John Oswald, who fell out of love in India with British rule in India, became a Hindu, became a vegetarian, and eventually joins the Jacobin Club in Paris and is killed leading a regiment of pikemen in the Vendée against the Royalists. But at this date, he's rather closely associated with Gillray. He's an atheist, and this is an anti-Christian publication, especially the bit that Gillray does, which is the illustration of the investigation into just what the serpent was that tempted Eve in the Garden of Eden. And there are 3 prints to go with this publication, 2 of which are done by Rowson, and the third one is Gillray's contribution. They decided that the serpent that tempted Eve was none other than Baal Peor. And how could Eve be tempted by such a flaccid thing? Well, this wasn't flaccid. the serpent that Moses erected was a strong, big thing, and he did it after his wives ran off with their Irish valets. It's really quite a funny piece of writing. I recommend it. This is Gillray being thoroughly sacrilegious. Although, once again, you notice where the foot is. Thou shalt not make any image or likeness of anything. We're interested again in censorship, and Gillray is always opposed to being controlled. The one piece of evidence we've got that might suggest to me that Gillray might have illustrated those pamphlets is the one erotic print by Gillray that is known. It took me a lot of trouble to get Andrew Edmonds to agree to let me illustrate it, but he did in the end. It's the only known copy. So Gillray, it's the only known copy, probably because the others were, one way or another, destroyed. And the culprits, I reckon, after quite a bit of thought and investigation, were the Society for Putting into Effect His Majesty's Proclamation Against Vice, founded by William Wilberforce in 1787, with a small bunch of churchmen, including one Dr. Bowdler, who later did the same with Shakespeare. And they made it their business from early on to round up erotic prints and things that they deemed generally unsuitable and destroy them, prosecuting the perpetrators. Several offenders in this line have been convicted and have suffered the punishment of their crimes. Lenity has been shown in other instances where there seemed reason to hope it would not be misapplied, due care being always taken to ensure the suppression of the work or the destructions of the plates from which the evil was apprehended. And I reckon you've got in the late 1780s and early 1790s a mass destruction of this Danton-esque pornography that accompanies a group of people in the run-up to revolution. I don't know whether the Society forced Gillray to alter a March to the Bank or whether he sold it in two different editions. But one way or another, the fishwife on the left under the toe of the... Whoops. What has happened? Happily it's come back. Under the toe of the prancing officer is covered up in the second state, as is the penis of the child who is having his face crushed by the marching grenadiers. He gets an eel delicately biting his in the second state. Gillray doesn't pull his punches with the royal family. We're on to Samuel William Fawes now, the rival of William Holland, who also bigged up caricature in the 1780s, establishing caricature exhibitions and suggesting new ways of doing things and producing larger sized prints. The 4 in the bottom left-hand corner is the price, 4 shillings for a bigger print. That's probably Gillray's handwriting on there, identifying the figures. We think this was often done in albums which were in the shop, and people leafed through them to choose the prints that they were going to buy, and they were priced with identifying people on there. some images of Gillray's are really fairly simple. I mean, there's a story behind this one, but essentially you rather easily get the message that the royal family are eating John Bull's blood in guineas. And you can imagine that displayed in a shop window is not doing much for the reputation of the monarchy. And quite a few conservative commentators like Septimus Knox, whatever he's called, become quite concerned about this. Septimius. And it's not just the king, the queen, and the Prince of Wales, because the Prince of Wales, his brothers, rapidly follow his example. The Duke of York comes back from his education and military training in Hanover, and promptly sets up a relationship with Lady Tyrconnell, whose husband turns a blind eye. This one published by Aitken, who another publisher, who Gillray uses especially at this period when he's doing something slightly dodgy, possibly libelous or liable to suppression. And Aitken selling his standard size prints at this stage for 1 6 price engraved in the bottom corner. And the Duke of Clarence, the next son down, comes back from his training in the Navy under Horatio Nelson, and promptly falls for an actress, Dorothy Jordan. She was a rather fine comedian and a rather lovely person. He went off, set up in Bushy Park, and had 10 children with her before he decided that actually he was impressed on him that he needed to marry a proper princess, some German or other, and there was a possibility they might have to become king, so she gets abandoned. It's all too good to be true, because at the moment this relationship is set up, Dorothy Jordan is playing a girl on the stage who is miraculously translated into the bed of a nobleman. And so Gillray just gives her the words that she's saying on stage. What pleasant dreams I've had tonight. And so it goes on. He's very, very clever with words. I love Gillray and words, as Ursi there will probably tell us tomorrow. Gillray, he'll draw things really, really quickly, and then he spends ages working out the titles and the very best form of speech and this kind of thing. So his drawings are covered with words and workings, but he's very, very good at it. The titles are funny. The references are funny. And if he says vidi something or other, you are meant to go away and read it, because the context will say something else that he hasn't said. So yes, in the background, we're working, 1789, there's a revolution in France. There's already been one in America. And things are getting a little bit hairy as the Revolution Society, that's the society set up to celebrate the glorious revolution of 1788 in Britain, celebrates the second anniversary of the revolution in France. And Gillray imagines that this is how much Charles James Fox, who is wearing George Washington's uniform, would love to execute the king. How, the hopes of the Whig Party are to have another execution of Charles I. So Gillray imagines this implicating Richard Brinsley Sheridan holding the king's head, Charles James Fox wielding the axe, Priestley, whose house was being burned down at this moment. But it's double-edged, because you've got an idiot of a king going, what's the matter? Doesn't, he's recovered from madness a little bit earlier, and he doesn't know what's going on. And Gillray revels in, during that Regency crisis, the Pitt and Prime Minister William Pitt and the Queen had become very close, and there's a sort of running gag that Pitt, who is excited by no woman, might possibly be excited by the Queen, at least at this moment when he is being hanged. She's, these merciless, goggle-eyed portraits of the King and Queen Charlotte and their desperate lust for money as the Duke of York marries a Prussian princess. Gillray's merciless with it at this date. It marries a Prussian princess, and Gillray celebrates the royal wedding of the Duke and Duchess of York with, she had famously tiny feet. I think we're going to see this once or twice in the next little while. But that's Gillray's fun. But only one impression survives with contemporary colour. The British Museum have recently realised that theirs is one of the Maclean reprints of 1830. The plate survived, though. So what's going on here? Well, maybe somebody bought up the whole edition to stop it going on the general market. And this becomes the kind of blackmail that caricaturists can pull off. Cruikshank does it regularly later on, and especially against the Prince Regent in the 1820s. It becomes a motif, but I suspect it's probably going on. Something like that is probably what happened in this case. Similarly, this print, which I only recently discovered, though it's in the Yale YCBA catalogue online, and somebody, maybe Richard Godfrey, thought to attribute it correctly, I think, to Gillray. But there's only one impression known. So this is the Prince of Wales whilst he is still ostensibly in love and living with Mrs. Fitzherbert, going off with an actress, Maria Crouch, who was at that time involved with an actor, Mr. Kelly. And one has to suppose perhaps that Mr. Kelly or the Prince of Wales or Maria Crouch decided that this needed suppressing and bought up the edition. Meanwhile, things are hotting up. This is Gillray's response to the proclamation against seditious writing of 1792, where it is made plain that things like Tom Paine's pamphlets are no longer acceptable, and it is the Crown and Anchor Society is set up, and they make it plain that the same applies to prints. And Gillray, initially at least, just takes the piss by showing, referring back to the previous proclamation against vice, and giving you personifications of vice in the shape of the various members of the royal family. And he follows that up with Sin, Death and the Devil, which I love, but I'm not going to go into in detail here. It shows it's about a quarrel between the Lord Chancellor and William Pitt and the Queen, as Sin is interceding between them. But in June 1792, it's hardly a sympathetic portrayal of Queen Charlotte. Milton wrote, she seemed a woman to the waist and fair. Gillray has cut the and fair conspicuously. Anyway, it's a parody of Hogarth. But in a sense, I think you just can't take it seriously as criticism of Charlotte, because it's just such a fun parody, and it's Miltonic, and it's doing all sorts of things. But yeah, in 1793, they started arresting people. They picked up William Holland. They picked up James Ridgway and stuck them in Newgate. They also picked up the Birmingham bookseller James Belcher. The other two are done for selling Tom Paine. he is done for selling Tom Paine, but also for selling and dispersing books, pamphlets, and publications also of exhibiting in his windows for sale a variety of caricature prints, such as one published by Fors, one published by Holland, and Gillray's voluptuary under all the horrors of digestion, which you might think's a fairly innocent print, really, but not here. These are done for the wicked purpose of ridiculing the king and the royal family. And that wicked purpose they're trying to stamp on. Gillray gets scared. He produces a series of prints pro bono publico, which are very difficult to read, but on one level at least are warning the public of the dangers of the French Revolution, and that maybe we shouldn't have such a thing in Britain. And after we're already arming for war. It takes 6 months to get the British Navy into operation, and they started that process in September or so. But he is still taking the mickey. There are about 4 or 5 known copies of this print, which says almost the opposite to The Blood of the Murdered, which, demands sympathy for Louis XVI. Here you are, the poor old Louis, and he's lost his appetite, which he was famous for, and has gone for the bottle and defecating in fear. It's a parody of the parting of Charles I and his family, and a parody of a print by Cruikshank. So we go to war. The Duke of York is put in charge of an army that goes into Flanders with the aim of marching to Paris. They start quite well by capturing Valenciennes, and Gillray is sent out to do quick pen portraits for Jacques de Loutherbourg, who's going to do a huge picture of the siege of Valenciennes. And what Gillray sees doesn't impress him, we are led to believe. The campaign goes horribly wrong. The British retreat towards Dunkirk. Where have I heard that before? And evacuate by sea. So when Gillray next year produces this print of the Duke of York presenting the keys of Paris to a delighted king, it's a savage, that was what was supposed to happen, but it isn't what did happen. James Suckfizzle, his secretary, is coming out with a list of achievements, and they've captured all the useless things. And I just love Pitt there sitting in the corner, dreaming up new taxes not to be felt by the swinish multitude, which was the famous phrase of Edmund Burke for the ordinary people. Bricks, rum, brandy, water, air. And in the background, Charlotte's getting the money in again. Spy money, money for toads and flatterers, pin money, 50,000. And so we go on. It's pretty savage. Gilray's handwriting again at the bottom. And so he goes on into the dreadful year of 1795, where the price of bread shot up so fast he couldn't keep track of it in one print. He's a bit double-edged with Pitt. There are one or two that are favourable, but most of them are pretty savagely critical. This is a very complicated thing. The prophet Richard Brothers predicted that London would be destroyed on the 4th of June, which was the King's birthday. So Gillray published this print on the 4th of June, depicting Pitt as the rider of the white horse in the apocalypse, riding the white horse of Hanover, the Prince of Wales sucking his bottom, and Burke and others as fiends. Loughborough there with the wig. Gillray only ever depicts him as a wig. And trampling on the swinish multitude again, and kicking those who were destroyed for maintaining the word of truth, all the people who are advocates of peace. including William Wilberforce now, who's the one in the stripes at the bottom. Poor old Charlie Fox, the main victim as usual. And in 1796, Gillray was arrested. He was arrested for this. I mean, he was arrested in the wake of James Aitken had been locked up again. And so had one or two other print sellers who were targets of the Conservatives thought they associated loose morals with loose politics. I think that's a key thing. There's a wave of erotic stuff that goes with blackmail and goes with loose thinking in France at this date, and a lot of these Frenchmen actually come over to England, and there's a distinct overlap in activity, and you've got a kind of Danton-esque thing going on. And Gilray's arrested for this rather harmless depiction of the birth of the Princess of Wales, suggesting that she might have come from the stable of Mother Windsor. And he's done for blasphemy. And the great thing about being done for blasphemy is that you're tried in an ecclesiastical court where you don't get 12 good men and true who might find you not guilty. You just get one judge. But nothing happens. And I guess why nothing happened is that Gillray is given a choice between the fate of going to court and laying off. Don't depict the king anymore in caricature. Give Pitt a little bit of leeway. He doesn't give him much, but he gives him some. And if you go along with that, maybe you'll get a bit of government work. And later in the year, he engraves a series of 20 propaganda prints for distribution in Holland. Well, at least they're about the Dutch situation. They're supposed to have been engraved in Holland, but actually they're clearly engraved in London by him. So there we are. That's the kind of closing point. You can't... Then the next year, 1797, Canning sets up the anti-Jacobin newspaper, and Gillray is recruited to do prints that kind of go along with it and support it. They're not illustrations to the newspaper, but they take their subjects from that, and he goes on to do government work because he hasn't really got much choice by this stage, because Charles James Fox in the foreground there is pretty isolated and just about everybody is on the other side. So he bows to that. And henceforth, he doesn't caricature the king anymore. He sticks him behind a pillar or just out of shot. Queen Charlotte has a hat over her head. And we still take the mickey out of the enormous Duke of Württemberg, who in other prints needs a wheelbarrow to get him around. And there I'll stop and turn over to the others. But if there are any questions, I'm very happy to take any.
Thank you so much, Jim. That was fantastic. And lots of questions. We have microphones.
Ursi.
Thanks so much. This was great. I just have a question about Hannah Humphrey because she published the presentation. Did she get in trouble for that?
Yeah.
No.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Oh God, I hate these things. Yes, I was just asking whether Hannah Humphrey got into trouble for publishing the presentation, and how much since now I have the mic, and how much she supported the kind of pushing the limits, i.e., sticking him behind a pillar and all that.
Yeah. Well,
And thank you for your talk.
she has her name on quite a lot of the dangerous prints. Although, as I said, he sometimes gives the really dodgy ones to James Aitken. It's actually a really interesting question, Ursi, because Fors was arrested. Aitken's shopman was arrested for selling this print, or the previous print. And Gillray was arrested, not Hannah Humphrey. And maybe that tells you that people knew that they were effectively a business partnership by that date. Because I think that's what happens with Hannah Humphrey. The value to Gillray is that he gains control over the production of his own plates. He was being paid 3 guineas a pop for a plate, and then it goes into the hands of Samuel William Fors or William Holland or whoever else was paying him, and they have control over it thereafter, and they make the profit out of his growing reputation when they sell reprints of the same thing. Once he is settled down with Hannah Humphrey, we don't know what their relationship was, except that Gillray eventually left everything to Hannah as his best friend, and they went round. They behaved as a couple. They went round together. They went on holiday together, and they lived together. Which room Gillray lived in, I don't know. She might have been having a lesbian relationship with her servant Betty, for all I know. But they act as a business partnership. So it's Gillray who gets arrested, and she isn't threatened, and I don't think she was ever seriously threatened. Can't immediately come across a woman who is Darley gets in trouble rather than Mary Darley, but then that's perhaps more obvious. It could be. Yeah, I can't really say.
Hi, thanks for the talk. It's really interesting. You mentioned on a number of occasions this Darnton-esque milieu in which Gillray is working with. So I just wanted to kind of ask you about that. How Darnton-esque? Is it a Darnton-esque milieu that's revolutionary in the sense of desacralizing the monarchy? Because that's one way of thinking about it. Obviously, there is no revolution in Britain, so if it is, it didn't fully follow through.
Didn't
right.
take off.
Because there's another story too. There's the Colley-esque story about the reincarnation of the monarchy as a pillars of domestic tranquility and such. And so, where do you fall, between the Darnton and the Colley sort of stories?
Well, I think the Darnton stuff belongs to 1787 to 1792, and I think that somebody like John Oswald and possibly James Ridgway too really do fit very closely into the Darnton mould. And there's a certain amount of blackmailing going on. There's a certain amount of pornography, and there's some violent criticism of monarchy and other institutions, aristocracy generally, the church, that could have produced a revolution. And that's why there was a clampdown. The recovery of the George III becomes a hero in 1803 when, at his insistence, we go back to war with Napoleon. And, the King of Brobdingnag and Gulliver, which is not a Gillray, it's the invention of Colonel Bradel. Images like that are instrumental in it. I can't help feeling that Gillray plays his part earlier on, that in some of the images of George and Charlotte, the domesticity of it all is in some ways endearing as well as ridiculous. And maybe he contributes to a picture that actually makes George III acceptable. I mean, there is, I think, a clear transition from George III as one of the most hated monarchs anyone has heard of to a sort of aged hero of the people. And it's partly achieved because of the war with France, because the nation becomes completely committed to that. And, yeah.
I think we'll take one more question in front from Joe, and then maybe we'll bring Martin and Steve into the conversation, because I'm sure questions will arise for all.
Later on.
Thank you very much for the talk. The playwrights had to deal with the Lord Chamberlain. Was there any kind of institutional structure?
No.
No. Who made the call?
Who made the call? Well, that's quite an interesting question. If I knew the answer, I'd be on more secure ground. In some cases, it is the committee of the Proclamation Society that later becomes the Vice Society and survives in that guise for ages. But I suspect the call is usually coming from the Treasury. The patronage secretaries of the Treasury, that sort of policing. But it's, and of course, it may be coming from several places because I've described several kinds of censorship. But yeah, John Reeves and the Society for the Crown and Anchor mob for preserving liberty and property are another potential source. It's they who are naming publishers as dangerous people and looking for reasons to round them up in 1792-3. But it's probably a question that has several answers. Yeah. If you'll allow me, I'm going to go and sit and watch their talks.
Yeah, I was painfully watching you guys crank, so I wonder if, whichever one is not speaking, you might want to sit up front. Anyway, people can hear me. So we are going to have Martin and Steve each come up and do a brief presentation about their own engagement with Gillray, and then we'll bring everybody back for the panel discussion and questions for everybody about how all these things connect. So, Steve, you want to start?
Okay. Right. Thanks very much. Thanks, Tim. That was the talk about Gillray, as well as the book that I've been waiting for too. I think it really was to get that sort of sequence I understand a lot of stuff for the first time thanks to you, though I've been looking at Gillray for a long time. I'm going back to, of course, I see them as a sort of duo. There's Temperance eating a frugal meal from the similar period, and they're very scathing of the monarchy. Now, it's, you're drawing attention to censorship, and I suppose we can relate that to the way we work. But you mentioned in your speech, you wouldn't be able to get away with that today. That's perfectly true. There's so much that Gillray did that you wouldn't dream of even trying on. There's a lot of stuff that we can do that he probably couldn't have done, and we certainly have a good deal more freedom than there was no real freedom of the press in Gillray's day. But it's understanding that and to understand the pressures he was under is so important. So, again, thanks for that too. This is just the wonderful lèse-majesté of the frugal monarch eating a boiled egg. It's almost a loving representation, but this is when he was very unpopular, as you said. And, sorry, wrong way. This is his eldest son, the same thing with the voluptuary. And this became a model for the way the world saw the prince almost ever afterwards, because it was adapted into, loads of, especially Cruikshank adapted it and then took it into his collaborations with William Hone. And I'll go through quite quickly because you've done it all already. This is always been one of my favourites, Hopes of the Party. Just the sheer, I suppose, the sheer cheek of it, but also the sheer bravery of doing it at that moment when the monarchy was about to fall in France. This is just before, this is 92, but you're right, they're imagining it, and imagining it used to be a capital offence anyway. And then this one, when it's actually happening, and this is, again, the sheer cheek of it. He's doing this incredibly sort of, it's not sympathetic in any way, shape or form. And it's about the same subject as this, of course. This is the blood of the murdered crying for vengeance, which of course is a straightforward, you could say it's a piece of propaganda, but then I suppose it's paid for. It's got a very clear message. And people's feelings are, of course, mixed about when a king gets his head lopped off. It's you sort of part cheer and you're part shocked. It's a shocking event, obviously. Similarly, this is stuff now we're talking. This is the anti-Jacobin era. This is the stuff that's. But it's so lurid. It's so venomous against the Jacobins. He enjoys it immensely. So he's enjoying it in the way he enjoys lambasting royalty. So he offends. He's an all-round offender. But it is the most. It came to sort of characterise. It was a very powerful piece of propaganda, and there's no doubt it is propaganda. And what always impresses about Gillray is the sensitivity of his line. Now it can be, it can be crude, but he can also be. He has a kind of academic intensity, a kind of look at the faces of the priests, the way that's drawn, almost the stippling on the buttocks is but then you have something which is apparently as crude as this, which is, similar to un petit souper à la parisienne, family de sans culotte, refreshing after the fatigues of the day. Now this is absolutely obscene. I wouldn't dare try anything like this. Oh, well, Martin might, but but it's utterly crude, but it's utterly compelling, and he's clearly enjoying it. That's the thing. It's not. His political sympathies are perhaps, possibly mixed or perhaps contradictory. But it was, as I say, a very venomous and very successful piece of propaganda. So I did this back in. It was the 200th anniversary of the French 1789. I did it in The Guardian. It was an illustration. I'd been working in The Guardian for 8 years by then. And it was to illustrate a piece about the French Revolution. And there I am. It's a crude caricature. It's nothing. Doesn't look anything like Gillray. It isn't really Gillray, but it's Gilray's images. How they are. They are, of course, propaganda, being used to caricature this noble. There's a sort of reverential image of a sans culotte. I think it might be Swiss. I'm not quite sure who did the original, but anyway. So I'm putting the two against within the backdrop of the Bastille, of course. So one of my earliest reuses of so of course I've borrowed from Gillray all the time. I mean, doing. Shortly before this, I've been doing a strip for all those. Did the strip for 42 years. After about 9 years, I started doing large format cartoons in the newspaper, and it's a daily, relentless demand. Means you fall back on. Well, how do you think? You think of some. I often think of a specific image of Gilray's. Why is it so powerful? And of course, the plum pudding is the ultimate political cartoon. It says everything. It's a perfect visual representation of geopolitics, if you like, but it has so much more in it. And so I did a version with John Major and Helmut Kohl. This is from 1996, and introducing the single European cow. There was a talk about the single European currency, which is in the pipeline, and it sort of did for John Major in some ways. But but there was all the problems of the common agricultural policy, which involved terribly sort of distorted cows with massive udders and things like that. So it all goes into that. So I'm if you like, I'm surfing on the top of his great reputation and using his huge artistry. And I never use this one, but I love this picture. That's just to show you the difference. This is from the Yale's own copy. It's a beautiful thing, but what I like about this is it gives you a sense of the colouring, the importance of colouring, what the difference is. See, the importance of chiaroscuro, how powerful that is. Now, it's all there in this, but obviously the print has faded a bit. But the drawing is so beautiful. But it also contains almost the entire House of Hanover in one picture. That's what's so interesting about it, minus George's 1 and 2, and Queen Victoria, but all the others are there, which includes the fat guy in the blue is, of course, George, Prince of Wales. The guy behind him in the red is, of course, Duke of Clarence. They both became kings, of course. He became George IV, he became William IV, the glorious sailor king. More of him in a little bit. Well, in fact, here we are, straight into. This is a lovely thing called La Promenade en Famille, which refers back to Dorothy Jordan, who he became not just infatuated with. They lived together and they had a very thriving family of, as it turned out, illegitimate children. And he's so recognisable, his glorious profile of his. This is his official portrait. It's William the Sailor King. There he is. That's how he would like us to see him. And this is his direct descendant. And this perhaps explains something about David Cameron, who is a super toff in some ways. He's so upper class. This is references to the British class system. But William IV was his great-great-great-great-great-grandfather on the wrong side of the blanket, of course. So his mother, through his mother's line, he's descended directly from William IV, which gives him this unstoppable sense of, entitlement. And that explains something about his character and about him. My way of tackling him has nothing to do with Hogarth, but it's in the spirit of Hogarth. I'm wrestling with the same problem day to day. I have more leeway, a lot more leeway. And this is what I came up with, because these posters appeared around the country when Cameron was running for Prime Minister, with his head on one side, this impudent head. And he was saying, we'll cut the deficit, not the NHS. So he was sort of, so they're going to have, what he was proposing was a massive programme of austerity, which did quite the opposite. It's virtually destroying the NHS now as we speak. So I got so fed up with this stupid head sticking up, I thrust a vast condom over it. And it was published, to be fair to the Guardian, they published it. But the very next day, I received a memo, indirectly, down via a member of the comment team, saying that the editor does not want to see any more condoms. Which... no, that would have been a good thing, but no. No, it was like an outright ban on condoms, which is really odd. Because Alan Rusbridge was the then editor. He did have a prudish streak. Alan was, very gay. I had a hell of a lot of leeway working that paper, and not anymore because I've been forcibly retired now. But I did this, and for me, it summed him up, because he once came up to me during the election campaign in 2010. He said, he came I was covering with a camera person, a filmmaker, and we were in a car driving on the election, following the battle bus from Carlisle down to, I think, Grimsby. That's right, which is quite a long journey, and we stopped for a meal halfway, and then we saw the battle bus come into the car park, so we went to have a look, because we'd having a burger for tea. And the upshot was, we didn't have the camera with us, but Cameron came straight over and up to me, because I didn't introduce the man. He said, "Hi, Steve." And he looked at me in the eye, very direct stare, with his sort of crow's feet. He said, "What's this condom thing all about?" So I said, well, I thought, presence of mind. I said, "It's to do with your extreme youth," he's much younger than me, "and the smoothness of your complexion." So that was it. we nodded a few niceties and went our separate ways. I carried on following him. But it's the only time any Prime Minister ever said anything like that. But of course, I used it. From then on, I was able to do it. I had to fight to get the condom through, because Alan Rusbridge didn't like it at all. But eventually, after some stand-up battles, he finally conceded. And here's one worth. That's Ed Miliband, who was the then leader of the Labour Party. And the turkey itself is the Liberal Democrat bird of liberty in the form of Nick Clegg. Yes, that's right. This is again. What can you say? It's just a glorious. The original is a kind of a bit of a squib about Pitt's sex life, but it's about a very round lady and a very thin Pitt. But with this, it's the cardboard man and the pink rubber man. It worked for me anyway. Of course, I keep coming back to it. This is later on, 2015, where if you like, the Scott Nats. There was a kind of unspoken agreement between the Scott Nats and the Conservatives. Who obviously hated each other, but they hated Labour more. And what happened? It wiped out Labour in Scotland, effectively. So it's vote Labour and the world is yours when they're being carved out. And it was very effective, as I said. This is a couple of years later, 2017, by which time Cameron's gone. Theresa May, because of Brexit nonsense, and Theresa May has taken over as Prime Minister. Theresa May being a very unusual Prime Minister that you can identify by her feet. She has a kind of flamboyant way of dressing, but she also was very particular about her footwear. She used to wear these leopard skin kitten-heeled shoes. So, of course, I think we all did it. We all exaggerated her feet, and it's great to have a character you can simply define by their feet. And then she went to visit Trump. She was actually the first world leader to visit him. And my old mate Kipper Willis, who's also a cartoonist, I've known him since we were students together in Leeds. He sent me an email. I said, "Hey, why don't you do with a little sketch of of course, the fashionable contrast, which we all know by now." And I thought, God, that's a good idea. So I made a few little flips of my own. I inverted it so to give it a slightly more disgusting edge. But it was the tiny orange feet that got me. But anyway, the contrast of feet. And there's more of the. Well, this is Putin and Kim Jong Un. And again, this is back to the feet again. Again, this is the Helsinki meeting between Trump and Putin. And the speech bubble is in trying to ape the Russian. Absolutely, in this couch. That was well, I had to remove it, but never mind. I can't really. It's mild censorship on the grounds of good taste, but this is, of course, Brexit expelling darkness, but of course it's light expelling darkness. You know the original, and with Theresa shooting herself through the head because Brexit went well for nobody, and Boris, who's probably about to take over, taking the chariot of Trump and Putin over the cliff. Again, this is the summit between Trump and Kim Jong-un. Again, the plum pudding in danger again. Well, who knows? He's actually sitting on the earth this time and it's sort of dissolving in farts. This kind of a sumo wrestling thing. And finally, the dead duck in danger. This is Theresa May, who is completely moribund. Brexit destroyed her. She held an election to strengthen her majority. She was apparently in a very strong position because she was running against this left-wing terror threat called Jeremy Corbyn. And hey presto, she lost her majority. And Labour, under the terrorist threat, gained 30 seats. But anyway, the more noddy character is her contender for the leadership, against Boris, who was the other. Boris and Gove, standing for the Conservative leadership, and that's Jeremy Hunt, who became Chancellor subsequently and had been Health Minister for many years. And this, of course, is an excrescence, a Marxist, a rosebush upon a dunghill. This is from 2019, by which time there's an election imminent, because, of course, there was no majority. So one had to, and they were trying to desperately push through. Unfortunately, it was fought on very shaky ground. Labour was bitterly divided, and a large chunk of its party was actually trying to get rid of him more vigorously than the Tories. But that's my view of it. This is later, 2021, when Prince Charles was refusing to communicate with his second son, Harry. An heir upon a dunghill, not taking any calls from his spawn. He was still the Prince of Wales in those days. And then finally, my very favourite one of all, which is a new map of Bumland and Macronia, of course. This is triggered by a lunatic dispute about, I think it was concerned with fish, around the island of Jersey, which of course is down on just off the French coast, but of course it's British. So gallant little Bumsy there, and there's these two ships, HMS Tamar and HMS Seven, were sent out to guard our fish from the filthy French. So in prospected world, anyway, I went to town on the West Bumsex, East Bumsex, Bumshire, and anyway, so I won't go into it. I had a ball doing that. But it's all down to this. This is, I think, for me, the perfect political cartoon. It's, of course, it's Pitt. You've described it already, and it's so slighting about the idea of monarchy. That's why it's not just. I think whoever was commenting on about it's coming from monarchy. The monarchy is rooted in shit, and the mushroom comes out of it. So the roots of the monarchy are in the crap, and that's what I delight. It's so simple. It needs no words. It doesn't need me to tell you what it's about. The caricature of Pitt is just perfection, and it's a mushroom too. What else can you say about it other than it's glorious? And the colour too is so important. The colouring is beautiful and simple and a toadstool. And finally, of course, the great one, the one we all revere, the plum pudding in danger, estate epicures. Apparently this is a quote from the Tempest. The great globe itself and all which it inherits is too small to satisfy such insatiable appetites. It's just such a wonderful, perfect. It's, again, the perfect card. Two perfect cartoons. Two perfect political cartoons. Thanks.
I think we're going to bring up Martin next and then poll questions for all three of our panels when everything's done.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks, Steve. I remember laughing myself stupid at the bum, the bum boats cartoon. I just thought, God, you've had so much fun doing that. I could just see you. Another bum. I'm going to do another bum. I'm going to do another bum. I'm going to do another bum. Firstly, I wanted to say that Tim's book is one of the best books of art, biography and history I've ever read. And I reviewed it in glowing terms in The Guardian because it achieved something which all previous studies of Gillray I had encountered and come across had failed to do, because Gillray was almost an empty piss pot into which people would piss whatever they chose. And there were a lot of people saying he was a caricaturist without a conscience, he was a radical who'd betrayed his principles. He was a hack. He was like me and Steve. He was just, making a living. And the way Tim created the world in which Gillray operated so precisely, so the little we know about Gillray is so packed down that there is a Gillray-shaped hole in the middle you can fill in with everything around it. It's absolutely brilliant. And Gillray has been a huge part of my life, and one of the reasons I wanted to become a cartoonist. At the age of 10, when I picked up my sister's history school textbook, The Illustrated History of Modern Britain, published in 1953, illustrated, as these things often are, throughout with cartoons. And there it is. There is the plum pudding in danger. There, Steve's already talked about it. Tim's already talked about it. It's the type specimen for a political cartoon. Whenever I talk about political cartoons, I come to this and say, this has got everything. It's got caricature, transforming real people into marionettes through recreation, marionettes being operated by the visual satirists to set them up in a ludicrous narrative of their own devising. And the point about it is powerful voodoo. You have Pitt the Younger as this long streak of misery. You have Bonaparte as this short arse who said that Gillray was more dangerous to him than a dozen generals because he always drew him as being short. And it's that big. You could take this, political cartooning is the last redoubt of symbolic painting. You could take this and paint it on the side of a palace wall and have statesmen in togas and gods and goddesses, and it would be terrible because it's that big. And it's about transforming these two men who are engaged in a global geopolitical struggle leading to the deaths of millions. And they're having a food fight. They're basically having a food fight, and it is ridiculous. It is pathetic. It brings them down to size because they're little tiny people on a little tiny piece of paper. And obviously, we all steal it again and again because it is the type specimen of a political cartoon. It's what we understand as how they work. It hasn't changed in the last 200 years, 225 years. This is a very early one of mine from 1983, when I've been a cartoonist, a professional cartoonist. Well, I say I was a professional cartoonist. I was signing on at the Dole at the same time as I was being paid not very much money by the New Statesman. But it's the plum pudding in danger, so there they are. That's Andropov and Reagan, all the way up till a couple of years ago. And here is Boris Johnson. This is a British footballer who was running rings around the government by calling for free school meals during school holidays for the poor. And there's Barnier, the EU's chief negotiator, who is eating the globe, and poor old Boris Johnson is in his high chair not knowing what to do. And this is something I did for a TV programme about the history of drawing of me and Gillray. You know, Gillray is puncturing the world, and I'm just sort of sitting at the side looking on in amazed awe. And on the 200th anniversary of Gillray's death on the 1st of June 2015, in my then role as the chair of the British Cartoonists Association, I commissioned the Cumbrian Plum Pudding Company to make us a plum pudding. I then browbeat two cartoonists who I helped in the beginnings of their careers. That's Ben Jennings as Bonaparte, who's now a colleague on The Guardian. This is Bob Moran, who I got a job as the lead political cartoonist on The Telegraph. And there they are, reenacting it, and they're carving it up. And we then, the cartoonists gathered at this dinner, and Steve was there, then ate the plum pudding, which was, I thought, a rather good thing. Poor old Bob Moran, well, I say poor old Bob Moran, is no longer the political editor of The Telegraph because during lockdown, I think it's fair to say that he went insane because he became a serious anti-vax campaigner. And, you know, he was calling on social media for people to physically attack NHS workers because they were poisoning our children with vaccines. And The Telegraph said, withdraw that statement. Here I stand, I cannot move. But of course, you want anti-vaccine stuff? Where do you go? You go to Gillray, again from the Illustrated History of Modern Britain, which I picked up when I was 10 years old, and I looked at all these wonderful things. And I remember going to my father's desk and finding some old steel nibs and starting to draw, trying to emulate the way Gillray etched. And this is Jenna bringing in the vaccine, the original vaccine with cowpox against smallpox, and this is the modern anti-vacuous, where you've got various right-wing demagogues, you wouldn't know who they are, lucky you is all I can say, erupting out of these Tory MPs who are being injected with the vaccine. He's there all the time. Gillray is perching on our shoulders because we do what he did. He would pillage contemporary art like Fuseli, but also the history of Western art, in order to trigger a response in the viewer. Although viewer isn't the right word, I actually asked many cartoonists around the world if there is a word, if there is a verb that describes what you do when you consume a cartoon. There isn't one. There isn't a verb for it. Reading isn't right, looking isn't right, consuming isn't right, because they are so many things, the cartoons are so many things happening simultaneously, and I'll get onto that in a minute. But we pillage him because it will then trigger a response. So Steve has already had a sphere projecting against a plane. And this was Boris Johnson and his then Eminence Grise, the nominative determinants, Dominic Cummings, the Spaff King. Boris Johnson was always talking about spaffing, which is an Etonian term for a male ejaculation. And Cummings was called Cummings. So, it was a government of wankers, basically. And here, again, is a voluptuary under the horrors of digestion and temperance enjoying a frugal meal. When Steve and I first had our work put on the Guardian website in 2002, 2003, it was after 9/11, when the American liberal media had collapsed under pressure from the Bush administration, and an awful lot of people started reading The Guardian online in this country. And we consequently got a great deal of shit, I think is the word, let's describe it like that, because The Guardian, being a liberal paper, insisted we have our email addresses published under the cartoons online. And I would regularly, as would Steve, get thousands of emails. I mean, he drew George Bush as a chimpanzee, annoyingly got there before anybody else, but, I mean, that's what George Bush was, pant-hooting away. And I would regularly get, why do you draw our president as a chimpanzee? I don't, you ignorant clown. It's the other cartoonist who does that. But they would say, you would never draw your monarchy like this. He's our commander-in-chief. And I say, excuse me, and just come over and look at the glorious richness of anti-monarchical cartoons in the 18th century. And it just, again, you use something like this to trigger this cartoon I did, which I was very pleased of, Ye Constitution, take another letter to Her Majesty's government, and as usual, we'll leave it to them to dot the I's, cross the T's, and lick my R's. And likewise, when the British government tried to do something about controlling Facebook in the form of Zuckerberg, I was obviously borrowing from this one, which, as we know, wasn't actually invented by Gillray, but it was certainly etched by him. But it's part of the canon, which we refer back to. And this one, which is absolutely my favourite. I mean, it's so hard to choose which is your favourite Gillray, but this is my favourite Gillray because it does that thing that political cartoons don't do so exemplarily well. They are a combination of text and image, which is why you don't read them, you don't just look at them, you do something else. And the way you can use text to undermine the image and vice versa. And here you have what appears to be a straightforwardly jingoistic image of Jack Tar, the naval avatar of John Bull, biffing Bonaparte after the Battle of Copenhagen, astride the globe. And it's called Fighting for the Dunghill, that it is basically just a load of shit. It's a thing from which the monarchy extrudes. And this was in the sort of fighting over UKIP and one of those stories where you can't even remember what this news story was anymore, but it was, based on fighting for the dunghill. And again, presage of the millennium. I don't know if you picked up the news story over here, but a couple of weeks ago, some horses escaped from a barracks in central London and galloped through the city of London, one of whom was covered in blood because it had collided with a bus. And talk about presages, talk about, we're not in a good state in our country at the moment. We have a government which is in freefall, and you suddenly had this, vote Conservative, continuing unwittingly delivering world-beating metaphors of doom. And there's a pretty as Steve saw this yesterday, so you've gone all photorealist. I wanted to pay homage to the horse, who wasn't well at the time. I didn't want to take the piss out of the horse, but I did want to take the piss out of Rishi Sunak. And these things in the background are something I've been using for the last 12 or 13 years. It's an homage to Merritt Oppenheim's Objet, which is a fur cup and saucer. And as an homage to a surrealist objet, it is pronounced with a thick French accent. It is a fur cup. It is a fuck up. It is a fuck up. Basically, it's a way of just having a fuck up written into the cartoon without spelling it out too obviously. How could you get away with such stuff? Well, how can you get away with anything? How can you get away with cartoons about religion? This was a cartoon I did at the time of the Islands Poston cartoon row, as it was called. It actually led to the deaths of over 100 people. In the first instance, they were all Muslim men and boys shot on the streets of Muslim countries by Muslim soldiers or policemen, having been fermented into riot by Muslim clergy. But, that's the irony is interwoven with everything. This was the first cartoon I did for The Guardian. I've been doing editorial cartoons for The Guardian for 11 years by this time. This was the first one that had to be approved by the editor, Alan Rusbridger, because it was such a terrifying thing, what was happening about cartoons. And interestingly, Cindy said, yeah, but we can't show that because it has got the face of the Prophet Muhammad in there. No, it's not. The face of the Prophet Muhammad is not in there. But we get so scared of our shadows and flickering flames that we think it might be. And there were some images which we've chosen not to show after the Charlie Hebdo massacre in January 2015, where I wanted to respond to this by actually drawing a picture of the Prophet Muhammad wearing a Not In My Name t-shirt. And I normally pitch the idea in the morning of the day the cartoonists are going to appear the next morning. And this time I gave it to them 2 or 3 days early so they could think about it. And they, to their credit, they actually consulted Islamic scholars And they decided it would be too dangerous. It would be too dangerous for Guardian staff working in the Middle East. And I'd have had to go into hiding. I had to get my children to say this was okay, that I should do this incredibly dangerous thing of drawing a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad, albeit a sympathetic one. And my son, who was then 25, sent me a rather heartening email when he said, well, I suppose it's okay, but if you do get assassinated, can I be the person to do it? Which I thought was... cheered me up, actually, no end. What I did instead of that was myself slumped on a drawing board explaining the cartoon I was going to do, saying, but weirdly enough, I don't want to get murdered to afford you bunch of bastards a wry smile, which made the point rather well, I think. And after that, I was accused of being the worst coward in the history of cowardice. There are men over there murdering cartoonists, and mostly men over there saying, we want you to die to pursue our geopolitical ends, and which leaves the cartoonists where? The cartoonists struggling to try and find some way of articulating this. It's not just the pressure of editors, it's not just the pressure of social media, the vilification. You can suddenly feel very isolated. Certainly after Charlie Hebdo, when I discovered a journalist friend of mine had police protection because he'd written a column about it. Just one column. I'd been on TV all the time talking about it. I said, but I hadn't heard a peep from the Metropolitan Police. He said, well, you haven't got police protection. Well, I've got police protection. Well, no, I haven't got police protection. Then it occurred to me, perhaps I shouldn't have called the Metropolitan Police the best police force money can buy quite that often in print. And, it's not called paranoia when they are really out to get you. But this was the absurdity when you have these world leaders walking through the streets of Paris. Or indeed, je suis Charlie, free expression first and last. And then the king of Saudi Arabia dies, so je suis King Abdullah. And ultimately, the only way you can get out of it, which is one of the main messages of Gillray and of our profession and of what we have done and have been doing, for thousands and thousands of years, whether we're doing it visually or doing it just through jokes, which are, after all, a survival mechanism for humankind, is to laugh at it. So this was my response for Index on Censorship, where you actually have a dog laughing at all these ridiculous religions, a cartoon dog, and gets killed by a jihadi, and then he grows a new head and carries on laughing. And, of course, one of the things we laugh at is shit, which is another great thing that Gillray gives us. This is one of my most treasured possessions. It is a self-portrait of Thug the pygmy hippo in London Zoo. Pygmy hippos, like common hippos, as they wander through the African jungle at night, leave a trail to allow them to get back to their riverine homes by morning by spinning their tails round like aeroplane propellers and spraying shit absolutely everywhere. So the zookeepers at London Zoo held a canvas with a stencil on it behind Thug. And that is hippo shit and fixative. It's called mixed media for any art historians out there. And of course, this is part of the great 18th century tradition, the great scatological legacy of people like Hogarth in very, very early Hogarth print, a non-canonical scene from Gulliver's Travels about the only thing that Gulliver doesn't have done to him is be given an enema by the Lilliputians. He's used as a dildo in Brobdingnag, but here is Hogarth marking his card. And this is something I did at the time of the London Olympics, when they said the International Olympic Committee said they would sue with fury anybody who breached their intellectual property rights by using the Olympic rings in an unauthorized fashion. So this is just a cartoonist pushing it as far as they possibly can. It wasn't published in The Guardian, it was published in The Morning Star. And sadly, they didn't take me to court because it would have been quite fun. And I discovered this Gillray cartoon. This is a Gillray cartoon I'd never seen before until I discovered it in a print shop in central London about 2 years ago. And it's the Marquis of Rockingham in his first ministry, in an arcane point about poor relief, simultaneously puking and shitting. I can think of no other image by any of us where you have a Prime Minister doing those both at the same time. And as I always say, this gets to the very heart of the British sense of humour, and it should be on the banknotes. And on we go, an early Gillray, a Scotsman not understanding how to use a bog house. This wonderful one, which of course gets to the heart of what satire is about. There's a man called Ian Hislop, who was the editor of Private Eye, who was always saying that satire is about puncturing pomposity. No, satire is repeating the line of the wonderful old Jewish joke about the kid who comes back from his first day at work and is complaining about the foreman being really unpleasant to him and bullying him, and saying that his mother saying, well, if he's so smart, how come he shits and he's going to die? And that's what satire is about. So reminding people who want to be treated like gods that they shit and they will die, tearing aside the raiments of power. And here is Pitt the Younger as King Midas in reverse, vomiting money and shitting into the Bank of England. And again, we have, this marvellous image of the king and queen at stool, and this one which Steve was alluding to earlier on, which is it's a jingoistic, patriotic image of the king embodying the nation, literally embodying the nation, with his head up in Northumberland and repelling the French invasion fleet through shitting out of his arse in Portsmouth, which I always say, for a British audience, if you've been to Portsmouth recently, you could see it's a photograph, And then we get to this, again, the presentation the wise men's offering, and as Tim explained, how Gillray got banged up for this. And, of course, he didn't explain Canning's role in getting him off. And this is one of my other favourite Gillrays, because it's one of those Gillrays where you could actually step into this and you could keep walking for a week. Just the artistry of this vision of a sans-culotte army invading London, and the gutters running with blood, and the defenestrations, and the general horror. And this is how Gillray repaid Canning. Okay, he repaid him by doing stuff for the anti-Jacobin, but he also repaid him by having him hanging from a lamppost in the background. Hardly noticeable at all. There's Canning swinging from a lamppost. And it is the articulation, the perfect visual articulation of the mantra of the satirist, where we are here to lower the tone. We are here to say the unspeakable thing. As Hunter S. Thompson, somebody once described Hunter S. Thompson, you admire him in the same way you would admire a streaker at Queen Victoria's funeral. We are there to say the unsayable, but in the most disgraceful way imaginable. And this is sort of fuck you. This is fuck you. And this is a cartoon I did when Tony Blair, responsible for the deaths of more people than any prime minister since Churchill, finally resigned because of his serial misjudgments. And I'm grateful to The Guardian for allowing me to do this. And it's called The Pun is Mightier Than the Word. And there he is saying, hey, everyone, look at these great retirement presents. A fork earth from all at the EU, a fur cuff from Gordon, and fair coffin dye from the grateful people of Iraq, Afghanistan, all you guys. I fuck off, and die. And it's very childish. It made me feel a lot better. It won an award subsequently. But somebody emailed me that day, and it wasn't a death threat, because I was getting quite a lot of death threats by email at that time. It was instead somebody saying, why do you have to be so unrelentingly negative all the time? And I just thought, sod this. This is a good joke. This is a fair coffin dye, the casket bleach, light towns. That's a good joke. So I emailed back and I said, well, actually, why do you have to email a total stranger to complain about something you didn't even have to look at? And anyway, I think fair coffin dye is a really good gag. And 20 minutes later, he emailed back saying, hey, I've only just got it. That's brilliant. And I thought then my work is done today, as it is for now. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you all so much. This has been, I'm really struck at how much fun everyone's having, and the fact that you've talked about, how you enjoy what you do. And I wonder if Gillray also did. But at the same time, really, really serious issues. And I'm wondering if laughter actually helps us think about things that maybe we don't want to anyway. But what I really need to do now is turn the microphone over to those of you in the audience who must have questions for our three panelists. David.
Thanks to all three of you. And my confession in this mood of candor, or should I say frankness, is that this is a planted question. I wasn't told what to ask, but I was told I should ask the first question. Moderator's prerogative, though I'm not in a moderate mood. There's a sentence in Tim Clayton's book that I almost quoted, but I saved it for this. To some extent, he wrote, it becomes possible to map Gillray's audience from his expectations. To appreciate Gillray fully requires sophistication. You must either be familiar with his references or prepared to go and look them up. And that sense of the qualifications necessary to reading, I'll use that word, cartoons, struck me also in the presentations by Martin Rowson and Steve Bell. So this is a wide open question, just asking you to reflect on that. Because for me, an American, but with slightly better than average information about Britain, on first glance, several of yours are difficult, in fact, too. I'd have to go look them up. Now, that's partly because they're not from yesterday, and I didn't read yesterday's British newspapers. But I wonder how that consideration about, on the one hand, being engaged in a popular art, and on the other hand, the requirement of sophistication, how that works on you in thinking about one subject and another.
Do I start with that one? Or do you want to? Well, I was just going to say that Steve worked for The Guardian for 42 years. I've worked for every paper in Fleet Street except for The Sun because they never asked me. So I actually changed my style. So I worked for 27 years for the Daily Mirror, and I would do. It's more obvious. I mean, they were still pretty hard hitting, but they were more obvious. But working for The Guardian has a sort of certain notion about itself, and I expect people who don't get the joke or don't understand the references to, as you say, go and look them up. Why wouldn't they? You know, people. I remember my children watching The Simpsons would constantly say, "What's that a reference to? What's that a reference to?" I said, "Actually, that isn't a reference to anything," and sometimes it isn't a reference to anything. But very briefly, during the coalition, I started doing very complicated images because the coalition was full of people, and there was one of George Osborne when he was introducing a spare room tax because he was going to tax people who were on benefits by taking away, I don't know, I can't remember the details of it, but he was him going into his spare room, and he's a very aristocratic person. It was actually crammed full of these visual metaphors for his stewardship of the British economy. And in the corner, right in the bottom right-hand corner, behind a hamster cage with a dead hamster on the hamster wheel, there was a goldfish floating upside down in a goldfish bowl. And I had about 10 people email me and say, "What is the symbolism of the goldfish floating upside down in the goldfish bowl?" And I said, "It has no symbolism at all. It's just a goldfish floating upside down." And I put it in deliberately to see what they do, because people begin to get sort of slightly manic about it. They like doing it like Sudoku. They like trying to interpret it. And sometimes they see things which aren't there, which I know to my cost. And so does Steve. So, but it is an illusionary art form, as Gillray displays, because he's making references not everybody is going to get.
I think taking a question another way, it's you're trying to intrigue, so you want people to be interested. In a sense, I don't, not bother when they go and look up the illusion. A lot of the illusions or the references are, obscure. On the other hand, the sense of the cartoon should be fairly clear, I think, and that's something you work out in advance. I don't think it's quite as random as you describe, but for me, the thing about the difficult part of the cartoon, it's as difficult as the drawing, but it's as important, and in terms of time, it takes just as much time as drawing does. It's thinking what you're going to say, how you're going to say it, what you're trying to do here in this cartoon, and racking your brains. It's a bit like solving a puzzle. So you're sort of desperate, but you're up against the deadline. But that forces you to think and forces you to edit yourself. And all right, I mean the references you use. That's why I'm often going to works. Well, I mean, not just Gillray. I've gone back to Doré, to Fragonard, to all sorts. Jericho and Delacroix, and on and on and on. I could go on forever. And I'm always borrowing. I'm always ripping off. I'm borrowing, using the way. Why do their images work? What is it about them that grabs me? What makes me want to look at it? So it's not like an invitation to go out and study this, which is frankly a bit of a hellish instruction to go and look at it. Martin once did. I think he put a reference in ancient Greek.
Yeah.
You didn't translate it. You bastard! Why not? I don't speak Greek.
I was just being annoying. It was Cavafy's
exactly.
line about the barbarians being at the gate. It wasn't ancient Greek, but it was.
Well, all right, Greek. It's all Greek. It's ancient. But if you do put something in another language, you should retranslate it. But I do strips, so strips are very wordy, so you can put subtitles on them if you want. I suppose I've always got the words out of my system in the strip.